I'm fairly confident that China has at least 10 times more gold than the World Gold Council says it does. I also think they have a lot more than the US. Don't be fooled by all these headlines and all the debates, Trump stupid, Trump genius. The real problem, there's too much debt.
Thanks for tuning in for the 7th episode of the Gold Telegraph Show. Today, I'm joined by someone whose voice has become essential in cutting through the noise of global finance, Matthew Piepenburg. Matt, it's great to have you on the show.
Well, Alex, I'm really honored to be here, and certainly lots to talk about in these crazy 5 trading days since the tariffs and all the other things going on. It's really going to be fun to share some thoughts with you.
Yeah, no, it's been a crazy week to say the least. But
yeah.
Matt, you've had a fascinating journey: law, hedge funds, family offices, and now you're one of, again, like the strongest voices advocating for gold. But before we dive into where things are heading, I want to start where it started for you. With all your experience in the financial arena early in your career, what was that moment that first what made gold stand out to you more than just a trade?
Yeah, like anyone in my generation after the dot-com bubble coming into Wall Street, I was all risk assets in general and tech in particular, and enamored by the IPOs and San Francisco and New York, but, 1998, 99, up until the NASDAQ tanked in 2000, 2001. But, when I had the luxury of the high class problem of a really good lottery ticket on a pre-IPO during that first dot-com bubble and at the turn of the century, I was still very much enamored by equities and credits. And then when we had a family office and I was a managing director of that family office, I had the really fantastic opportunity in education to talk to a lot of portfolio managers, many of which were in New York, but certainly some in London, Chicago, Asia. When you have a decent amount to allocate, especially when you combine in a multifamily office, they take your phone calls, and you get more than just an analyst, you get the portfolio managers. And at one point, it was probably literally around 2012, so over 10, almost 15 years ago, I was in one of these very important hedge funds in Wall Street in New York, and we were having a discussion about QE and the craziness of it and the bond markets. And I really did learn more about the bond markets after the hedge fund days. I was mostly just long short equity. And when I was allocating money, I had to be more mature. I was educated by some really smart portfolio managers in the credit side. That was probably the best thing that ever happened to me in terms of my education in the markets outside of school, which is just nothing compared to being in the trenches. And a portfolio manager and I were talking, we were just having an informal conversation after the more formal meetings. And he was mentioning a book that he was reading because he was more of a history guy than just a math guy, which kind of resonated with me. And it was a book that no one will heard of, and I certainly hadn't heard of it. It was written by a guy named Andrew Dixon White. And he wrote this book in around 1910, 1911, before the Fed was even in fruition, signed into law on that disastrous day in December 1913. But he was telling me about this fascinating book. And, Andrew White was a scholar at Cornell University. He was the president or the founder. He'd written this book, and it had the very boring title of Fiat Money, Inflation in France. It was about 90 pages. It was really thin, very boring title, an unheard of book on Wall Street. And he really was into it because we were fascinated at the time by QE 1 and 2 at that point. And long and short, this book was a fascinating discussion of France in the 1780s when they had the idea of QE 1, 2, 3, and 4. They didn't call it that, but it was identical. France was in a debt crisis. It was over its skis in war. It was debasing its currency. And it was just this incredibly astute example of how history does rhyme and, frankly, repeat itself. And you fast forward 10 years after that, I was in Frankfurt giving a presentation on just this, and it was called, and you can see it on YouTube. I gave one presentation in German and I gave one in English, and it's called The Faces and Cycles of Gold. But it's really worth watching. I'm not saying that to promote me. I'm just saying it's a fascinating history of how debt-soaked nations ultimately get into a liquidity crisis and ultimately debase their currencies to inflate their way out of debt. And they think it's a miracle solution, and Hemingway later called it the temporary prosperity, which does lead to permanent ruin. But debt crises always lead to a liquidity crisis, which always leads to desperate measures. And This book, written in 1910 by this scholar out of Cornell, is really, really worth the read. You can even, I think you can find the PDF on Google. I really highly recommend it because it'll blow your mind how similar it is. And so that's really why he started to talk to me about gold. And a lot of portfolio managers that were long short equities or credits were, over a drink after hours were buying gold, whether they were in Canada, whether in the US, whether they were in Europe. And I started to scratch my head, and I learned, I'm making this a simple, short answer, but I basically learned that fiat money, which fiat basically means whatever the government tells you it is, but fiat money and the history of fiat money and the decoupling and coupling with gold. But fiat money is a really beautiful ice cube, and it can hold its attraction for a while, but it slowly melts. And these masters of the universe, and I thought I was a young dragon slayer of the dot-com bubble, but they may be, flogging credits and bonds at bank X, Y, or Z, or trading long short with leverage at hedge funds A, B, or C. But they were preserving their own money in gold. They were doing that. It's not in the headlines. It's not in the Financial Times. It's certainly not in the Wall Street Journal. But the quote unquote smart money, or at least the inside money, knew that they were measuring their wealth in something that's melting gradually. In fact, pretty exponentially since 1971. And so whether you're a plumber, a carpenter, a hedge fund manager, a surgeon, dental hygienist, you're getting paid in dollars. Or if you're in Europe in euros, or Switzerland in francs, pesos in Argentina, they're all relative. Some are certainly better than others, but ultimately that money loses value very quickly over time. It's hard to see in the moment. And I just realized whatever way you measure wealth, how many zeros you have in your checking account, whether it's $1,000 or $1 billion or $1 million, that money isn't holding its purchasing power. So you have to insure the risk in fiat money. And I guess that's maybe a long answer to a short question, but it was that conversation with a portfolio manager. It was that book by Andrew Dickinson White. And then it was just, from that on, I was basically obsessed. And certainly the informal conversations with a lot of wealthy, successful people, and at least wealthy and successful by measure of their wealth, they were all having gold in some percentage. That's not true across the board. Certainly not true in the West, and certainly not true in the US. But these particular smart guys, for them, it was a no-brainer. They were just ensuring the purchasing power of their currency. It doesn't mean they were only in gold, of course. And I had the high-class problem from that point on. I'm still very much in favor of speculation. I'm still very much interested in the bond and stock markets. I still look at these things very carefully, but our whole point at Von Greyer's and my whole interest in gold now is not a get-rich asset. It is a preservation asset. It is a don't get poor asset. Don't be exploited by central bank policies, monetary policies, and fiscal policies that ultimately melt that ice cube at an ever accelerating pace. And it's not a gold bug issue. I'm very familiar with banking. I'm very familiar with hedge fund tactics. I'm very familiar with bond markets. I'm not against speculation. I'm certainly not disinterested in credit and equities, but you have to at least understand gold as an allocation. And for me, I feel very comfortable. I have a high conviction on discussing gold and recommending gold. I couldn't be flogging bonds or U.S. Treasuries for Goldman Sachs anymore. I couldn't do it. It's simply, I just don't have any conviction in it. And we'll talk a lot about debt and credit, but that's how it was. One book, one conversation, and then it started to gel.
Well, no, it's amazing. Well, it's fascinating how that kind of realization can open the door to seeing money and value through such a different lens. And when was it that book, Matthew, that really had, where in your mind, like fiat money started losing its credibility, and was there a personal inflection point where the current system just stopped making sense?
Well, absolutely. I mean, remember, this conversation was probably in 2012, 13. We already had the great financial crisis, 2008. We already had what was supposed to be temporary QE, just QE, but then it became QE1, followed by QE2, QE3, Operation Twist. By the time I had that conversation, QE was it was the debate. How is this possible? We started out with Hank Paulson asking for a $780 billion bailout, and before long we're printing trillions of dollars to sustain the bond market. So every rate conversation, currency conversation, or bond conversation was about QE. And we talked about how that is inherently inflationary. And we can get into the weeds of how people think QE is not inflationary. Of course it is. You can't expand the money supply without diluting the purchasing power of the currency. And I think, again, the inflection point really was QE was already just seemed counterintuitive. It seems too good to be true. It is too good to be true. Modern monetary theory, which is being peddled as this brilliant new idea, I've said many times, was neither modern nor monetary nor a theory. It had been done in 1720 in the John Law era. The Romans did it with the denarius. frankly, it's been done and failed many times. And certainly in 1789 France, that example in White's book just made it crystal clear. So this pre-Fed book, and then looking at what was happening at the Fed at the time, it came together perfectly. And I had to start thinking about gold differently at that point, because we were already all on Wall Street kind of scratching our heads as how long this charade, this Ponzi scheme of printing money, of solving a debt crisis by issuing more debt and then monetizing that debt with literally mouse click money. You can literally, at the Eccles building, add a zero to the Fed's balance sheet to sustain the markets. And that is temporarily euphoric. It does buy temporary prosperity. Look at the markets. Even then, we were all kind of wondering, when will it end? It seems so naive. Fast forward to today, we've had very few real crises. We certainly had 2020, but it's amazing that you can postpone, and you technically can, under MMT, have a market that never dies. You can always monetize it, but you can't do that for free. Von Mises, David Hume, Reinhardt and Rogoff, you can do it, but you will do it at the expense of your currency, which of course hurts everyone, but it hurts the middle class the most. And they have less hedging, less options, less alternatives, and frankly, for no fault of their own, less understanding of how monetary policy works, how fiscal policy affects credit and currencies. And so it was just a charade, and it was ultimately a rigged game. I even wrote a book in 2019 called Rigged to Fail, once I started to understand that more. And I wrote that book it came out just a few weeks before the March 2020 crisis, which was a liquidity crisis and a bond crisis and a debt crisis. So it all kind of gelled, but it was that first conversation and just self-education. I think the fact that it was an historical book, I'm fascinated, and so was that portfolio manager, fascinated by history, not just the history of markets, the history of money, and it's all tied to geopolitics, the history of wars, the history of social unrest. It's all very financial, and it's all driven by debt. And then I had to realize that my central bank was not going to protect my currency. So, like anything, I have insurance for my home, for my car, for my health. I had to get insurance for my money, and it wasn't 100% gold. It was just, come on, this is common sense, and it's a best kept secret not discussed on Wall Street.
Well, it's amazing, Matthew. I've said for years that gold is a hedge against human stupidity, and with how central banks have just injected so much liquidity into the system to mask the underlying issues, it really is a testament to why we're here today. And like you alluded to, you've written extensively on the steady erosion of fiat currencies through debt and monetary distortion. In that context, what role does gold play as an anchor in a system that feels like it's falling into disorder?
Yeah, I mean, that question is such an important one, Alex. It's going to take more than, in my typical fashion, more than a couple minutes, because I really wanted to stick home to people. I'll probably use the word liquidity crisis 50 times in this conversation. I really want that to really be the takeaway point from this, because, again, David Hume in the 1750s wrote about this. Von Mises, of course, wrote about this in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and Reinhardt and Rogoff today, more modern examples, but it's very simple. Debt destroys. It destroys nations. It destroys politics. It creates social discord. It certainly destroys financial markets. You start with that premise, and then you realize that everything, and I'm including the tariff headlines, the markets, the geopolitics, the BRICS, all the things that we can get into, everything is a debt crisis. Every market correction, crash, implosion from time immemorial, whatever the cause, whatever the needle, was always really a liquidity crisis because of too much debt. I mean, a debt crisis is a credit crisis, and a credit crisis is really a liquidity crisis. And I think let's be very clear to people here that really, especially in the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency, and certainly the U.S. dollar and U.S. markets, which are the piggy bank and the investment center of the world. I mean, liquidity, U.S. treasuries, U.S. dollars, is the grease for the engine of the financial system. It's the oxygen for the fire ripping these markets one way or the other. And if that grease or that oxygen is so important, when the debt and the leverage in the system is greater than the available liquidity, dollars, treasuries, sovereign bonds, you have a mismatch. You have a liquidity crisis. And just to make this clear, we don't have to go back to 1789 France or ancient Rome, the Ming Dynasty, Yugoslavia. Again, let's just look at recent memory, which is so conveniently forgotten in the headlines right now, because it's really important that every market crisis is a liquidity crisis which is a derivative of a debt crisis. And again, it's not that long ago, September 2019, the repo crisis. That should have made headlines, should have been discussed for months. It was quickly forgotten. And nearly was basically the too big to fail banks didn't trust each other's collateral. Repo markets went dry. Fed had to come in and mouse click a solution there. So that was the first real liquidity crisis of recent memory that we can all kind of remember, hopefully. But the trend is fascinating because you look at then in 2020 during the COVID hysteria and then the COVID crisis in March of 2020, that too was a credit crisis. There was not enough liquidity in that market. There was fear. And by the way, it was followed by unlimited QE. The Fed balance sheet went to 9 trillion after that quote unquote COVID crisis. S&P down 36%, would have gone down farther, much farther, but for this magical moneymaker, this printer, or this mouse clicker at the Eccles building. Okay, so that was 2019, 2020. Then you go to 2022, there was the gilt crisis, sovereign bond crisis in the UK. We had the higher for longer policy under Powell. Markets puked. It was the worst nominal return for stocks and bonds since 1871. Again, no one talks about that anymore. We just keep printing, making rate changes, pausing, pivoting, etc. And then, with the gilt crisis and the higher for longer and the market crisis 2022, we've kind of forgotten about that. Well, then you go to the next year, 2023, we have a banking crisis, Signature Valley Bank, First Republic, etc. Folks, that was not a banking crisis. That was a crisis in the underlying collateral, the bonds, because of the higher for longer policy. It was a liquidity crisis. So again, liquidity crisis, when there's not enough grease for that engine, that financial system of leverage and debt, the Keynesian model taken too far, the Wall Street too big to fail model taken too far, the Fed-driven markets taken too far. That's just another example of, we're out of grease, we're out of liquidity, things are breaking down. And of course, fast forward to April 2025, we have the tariff crisis. The headlines are galvanic about Trump. We definitely need to talk about tariffs and Trump. And there's good and bad to be said about it. But let's be very clear. The tariffs are just the needle. The problem is the red balloon that's been waiting to pop for any number of needles. But even this is a credit crisis right now. And in case, that doesn't make sense, there are two factors I think that are really adding kind of insult to injury on this. You got to understand that if you look at everything as a liquidity crisis where there's not enough grease, not enough liquidity, not enough dollars, not enough U.S. treasuries, you get into Eurodollar markets and all these things. But you've got also remember, in the meantime, between these crises, we had the sanctions against Putin. Don't want to get into a rabbit hole of what you think of Putin or Zelensky or our foreign policy. But one thing I think I'll be very clear on is that weaponizing the world reserve currency was probably one of the greatest mistakes by the State Department in its history. I wrote about it the day after and I said, this is how the West was lost. It's not an exaggeration. Grant Williams, Jim Rickards, others had similar opinions, so it's not my unique invention. But when you weaponize a neutral reserve currency, I'll remind people that even Obama said you can't do that against major powers like Russia. You can do it against Venezuela and Iran. You don't do that with the R in the BRICS, who's already in bed with China as a trading partner. That was a disaster because you're not going to trust that U.S. Treasury again. And if they freeze your assets, take you off SDR and it's off the SWIFT, other countries, friendly or not friendly with the U.S., are not going to trust that issuer. Just like you wouldn't trust a bank that froze your assets, you wouldn't recommend it to your friends. So that was that 2022 sanctioning was a huge moment because the BRICS reaction was not surprising. You now fast forward today, we've got 45 countries trading outside the US dollar. We've got 30 countries repatriating their physical gold within their own borders and zip codes because they don't trust that once risk-free return or return-free risk US sacred cow treasury. What did you expect? You weaponize that. Again, Robert Triffin came to Congress, said, don't go there. Keynes said, don't weaponize a neutral reserve currency. So you had this immediate and obvious BRICS reaction in trade settlements, in trade deals outside the dollar or net settling in gold. You also had the oil trade, which we can talk about. The petrodollar is an absolutely essential source of demand for the US dollar. It's not over yet, but it's crippling and it's changing, and that's undeniable. 20% of global oil is now sold outside the US dollar. It's going to get worse, not better, and we can show the proof of that. And then you had the BIS since 2022. No one understands this. No one talks about it in the media, declaring gold a tier one asset next to the US Treasury. But the US Treasury, again, is return-free risk. It doesn't beat actual inflation. Gold does. So gold is now a tier one asset The BRICS are net settling in it. They're moving away from the dollar. Again, not the end of the dollar, not the yuan replacing the dollar, but a clear hockey puck move away from the dollar. And then, of course, since we sanctioned the dollar or sanctioned Russia and froze their FX reserves and their U.S. Treasury access, Eastern central banks in particular, but central banks around the world, prior to that, were buying about 118 tons of gold a year. After 2022, the amount is now about 290. You've got to see there's a causation and correlation here. There's a distrust of this treasury, not just because it was weaponized, but also because our public debt is unsustainable, irrational, and unbelievable. And so it's an unwanted asset from a discredited issuer, and it's also weaponized. So these are major signs of countries, central banks, and economies slowly but surely, not overnight, but clearly moving away from the US dollar. On the other side of that, these are obvious signs. You've got the dumping of US treasuries to get cash because there is, and I'll say it again, a liquidity crisis globally and in the US. I mean, look at what's happening right now with the headlines. What we saw, the yield on the 10-year. Remember, yields go up when bond prices go down. There's some people, I want to make sure they understand that. And yields go down when bond prices go up. Typically, you would think the U.S. Treasury in a market crisis is a flight to safety and volatility. But yields have actually been going up, not down. They've been bouncing. They started at 3.5 on Monday. They went to 4.5 after hours. What's going on? Why isn't the U.S. Treasury, this once tier one, still tier one asset, the sacred cow of safe haven safety? And there's a couple really important things. I don't want to get into the wonky weeds of Wall Street and hedge funds, but there's of course these relative value high arb hedge funds that are doing the basis trade, where they're basically long cash U.S. Treasuries and short futures markets. And it doesn't need to get into this, but what is important is they're dumping U.S. Treasuries because the money they use to lever, and hedge funds do this all over the world, certainly in New York, and fund managers and reserve managers overseas do this too. When they see volatility in the markets, they start dumping their treasuries. They're worried about liquidity. And so there was a lot of selling instead of buying of U.S. treasuries. A lot of that was led by reserve managers and hedge fund managers, the kind of shadow banking system. Undeniable reality. Everyone on Wall Street who knows anything about alternative investments and hedge funds knows what's going on in that trade. So that's a very important trade that isn't making headlines. And there's, again, net selling. Why? Because there is a liquidity crisis. There is not enough grease to keep the system going. And when there's the volatility in the markets, the smart guys, what do you even call the hedge fund guys, are dumping. And they're caught because they're over-levered. They're over-levered out of the repo market, which is drying up, a liquidity crisis. And then there's this other trade. It's, again, really wonky. Don't want to get into the weeds. It's interest rate swaps. It's basically a cash exchange where you're floating fixed versus floating rates, and you're arbitraging. And when those interest rate swaps go negative, that's a very dangerous sign. The last few times we've seen interest rates go negative was March of 2020 during the COVID crisis, and then 2022 during the gilt crisis, and then 2023 during the banking crisis. And we're at 68 basis points negative. I'm trying to tell you guys, without getting into the weeds, that is a sign that the markets are thirsty for liquidity, that they're expecting deflation, in other words, a mean reversion in the markets, and that they're also expecting bazooka money for the Fed. So they're seeing short-term lower rates because of bazooka money. And so that's ultimately inflationary. So these are just signs from the big headlines, the big liquidity events, the weaponization of the dollar, and then even the little wonky things that happen on Wall Street that very few people should or could understand. Frankly, even me, my eyes gloss over and I look at interest rate swap spreads or basis point negativity or basis trades. But it's the bread and butter of Wall Street. It's the most important. The interest rate swaps are probably the most important derivative market in Wall Street, and it's drying up and it's going negative. Again, and if you look at even the intraday moves on the NASDAQ, we had a 12% rise in one day. That was the second largest in its history. The first largest was during the great financial crisis, and the others were during the dot-com crisis. So we're looking at, don't get happy when you see markets intraday move up. That's actually a sign of really bad secular trend south. I'm not here to time it, but please don't be fooled by all these headlines and all the debates, left versus right, Trump stupid, Trump genius, Trump crazy. We could make the case for each, but the real problem is, I've said this many times, Santa Claus can't solve a liquidity crisis when you're $37 trillion in public debt and over $100 trillion in household, corporate, and public debt. There's too much debt. There's not enough grease to keep those debt wheels going without bazooka money, without debasing the currency. This falls right in to the hands of gold, just because gold sits there and holds its value while paper money is in a sea of fiat, sea of misery. And I'll just stop at a couple more points I want to make. History is all about dollar demand. And you had the petrodollar. When we decoupled from gold, we knew the biggest problem was who's going to buy our dollars now. We don't have a gold backing. We got a nice deal with Kissinger out in the OPEC states. Boom, we got the petrodollar. Within a couple minutes of that, we also created the COMEX exchange. We can talk about that to manipulate gold down. So then we also had guys like Gaddafi and Saddam who tried to sell oil outside the dollar in gold or euros. And we know what happened to them. We don't want to get into the weeds of that, but it wasn't safe to mess with the US dollar. It's very important. And even with the Saudis, we had a deal where, look, you're getting a lot of oil profits, recycle some of those profits to buy our debt, to give us more grease. And even China, after the World Trade Organization entry, we thought this is great. They have a better trade balance than us. Their products are cheaper. Their labor is cheaper. Please, China, recycle some of your profits into U.S. treasuries. Let me be clear. All of those things, the petrodollar, the Saudi trade, the Chinese are certainly not going to be buying U.S. treasuries. All of those things are breaking down as we're talking about tariffs at the same time. So please understand, we are in the liquidity crisis, a historical moment. That doesn't mean markets tank tomorrow or today. I don't know what the next headline will be. Between this recording and the next time this is published, who knows? But the longer term direction is so predictable because, I'll say it again, we have a liquidity crisis because we have a debt crisis. There is not enough liquidity naturally in the world through productivity, tax receipts, or profits on the S&P to sustain or keep this debt bubble alive unless we debase the currency. It is the ultimate scenario for anti-fiat solutions, and gold is historically, I'm sorry, I'm not even going to get into Bitcoin. We can have another conversation on that. Gold is undeniably the choice of central banks, smart money, and certainly the clients that I have in 90 countries. So again, this isn't gold bugging. This is just watching the direction of the hockey puck slowly but surely moving away from a debased dollar. Yeah.
Well, and it's brilliantly broken down, Matt, about just the liquidity crisis that we're staring down, and this like even mentioning the recent banking failures of it being a collateral issue, and that really brings us to like gold as an anchor, and you've touched on it a lot in your writing and publicly, but its role as a foundation in the monetary system. Do you see gold, with all this stuff going on and globally around the world with liquidity issues and chaos and disorder, do you see gold pulling us back toward discipline, or is it simply just exposing how untethered the current monetary system has become?
Yeah, look, I don't see a gold-backed U.S. dollar anytime soon. I don't see that at all because no sovereign nation wants to take away its right to debase its currency and be chaperoned. There was a great speech by William Jennings Bryan, turn of the century, early 1900s, called The Cross of Gold. And basically his point was simplifying, but he was standing in front of a bunch of farmers during the Depression or pre-Depression and saying, look, if we had a gold-backed currency, there's just going to be no credit because there would be too much discipline for our credit system. And I think even now where we need to think about gold, and central banks are thinking about gold, not because there's going to be a new gold-backed yuan or a gold-backed ruble or a gold-backed dollar. I do think gold will be something in the central bank digital currency, which we'll talk about. But in the near term, I don't think we can afford to have that discipline because it would curtail our ability to print money at will. And so it is certainly what you're seeing in the BRICS and what we saw in Kazan in 2024, even they don't want a gold-backed BRICS currency. They want a gold participating net settlement currency or settlement currency. So in other words, the BRICS nations, and they showed us their hand, what they wanted to do in 2024 at the last BRICS meeting. It's 40% gold and 60% local currencies. The gold is kept in your own country. It doesn't have to be redeemable in Moscow or in Shanghai. We just want to escrow it. You have to show that you have it. You can trade. Even the BRICS don't trust each other's currencies, but they trust the gold component. So it's part of a trade settlement currency. And that's a foreshadowing what they're really thinking. And again, you look at the oil trade with China, their biggest, Kyle Bass is right. They need a non-dollar energy solution. They've needed it for generation because they're an oil importer. They're also a food importer. But they were happy to buy oil from Russia, and Russia was happy to take yuan for it. And they take that yuan, and the Russians use that to buy goods in China. Whatever delta is missing, they'll take in gold. So they're net selling in gold. Then they'll take that gold on the Shanghai exchange and convert it to rubles. So it's a very new part of international trade that terrifies the West, and it certainly terrifies Trump. They see it. His Treasury Secretary sees it. There's a move away from the dollar. There's more trust in gold than there is in U.S. Treasuries. And I think so. It's not about a new gold-backed dollar. And they're trying so hard to not say that out loud, but they need to get more credibility. They need more gold, not as a currency backing, but as the new future. And I think, again, in 2020, please, everyone can go see this for themselves. I'm not making this up. Christina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, during the height of the COVID hysteria, came out with a thing called the New Bretton Woods. It's literally called the New Bretton Woods. If you go to the IMF website, you type in New Bretton Woods. She has this beautiful, almost cartoon video comparing COVID to World War II and blaming all of the debt in the world on COVID. It was absolutely disingenuous. But what you did is you saw her hand. She's saying because of all this debt, because of COVID, not because of IMF, World Bank, central bank policies, which are absolutely drunk drivers when it comes to printing money to sustain debt. No, none of that is discussed. It's all COVID. It's all global debt. It's not our fault. But what we're going to do is we're going to have the new Bretton Woods at some point. This was telegraphed in 2020 because it will eventually at some point, not in the immediate future, but it will happen. We'll have a reset, a totally disorderly, crazy reset, which will include CBDC and a global currency of some form. US dollar will be a regional currency. But even in that video, that dishonest, disgusting, telegraphing psyop from the IMF, they show a nice little chart. At the base of that new pyramid of CBDC is gold, because they know that any new solution, any new reset has to have gold as a component to give it any credibility. Otherwise, it's just another form of digital fiat money. So to answer your question, gold is clearly going to be more part of the monetary systems to come. We all know that. And again, we can have a separate discussion for an hour on why Bitcoin won't be, but the Bitcoin crowd will hate me. Bitcoin is being used, it's being exploited, but it certainly can go up in price for sure in the near term politically. It's totally centralized, politicized, and part of this reset. But yeah, I think gold will have absolutely play an incredible role. I don't like the BIS. I don't like the IMF. I don't like the World Bank for a million reasons, but I agree with all of them. And they're already telling us 4 years ago, 5 years ago, that gold is a part of this new direction. Why? Because fiat money is melting, and U.S. Treasuries, the great sovereign bond of the U.S., the home of the world reserve currency, is not trusted, and it's not safe. It doesn't beat inflation, and it's been issued at such an extent that it's diluted its value. And that's not a gold bug argument. That is a bond market understanding. That is a credit market understanding. That is a debt understanding. And again, debt, credit, bond, liquidity crisis. I'll say it again. We are in an ever-evolving liquidity crisis that needs any particular needle. Could be a geopolitical event, a war, an assassination, a tariff headline. We're teetering, and we're living on really false narratives. The Fed is great at making narratives, but it's a switch. It's not a thermostat. They can't adjust the money supply and interest rates and just fix things like it's a thermostat. It's a switch. It's either print money or don't. It's either rates down to zero or not. And that's how desperate we are now. And I see bazooka money before I see a reset. I see massive fiscal spending, et cetera. So yeah, gold is definitely a part of the future.
Well, and with this unraveling of trust, it's obviously not just applying to fiat currencies anymore. It's bleeding into what many people, and you alluded to this, Matt, of like it is considered one of the safest assets in the world, which is of course U.S. Treasuries. But they're starting to behave like risk assets instead of safe havens.
Absolutely.
Are you surprised with the lack of response with this recent move this week from, we haven't really seen anything from the Fed. And right. I know you brought up a great point about the hedge funds. But are you concerned at all that, Japan and China, they're the two largest holders of those treasuries. And in this environment, do you think those sovereigns could be helping push this environment right now?
Well, listen, you don't need a pundit or a bond guy or a hedge fund guy or a gold guy to tell your viewers that if you're going to put 104% tariffs, which is a sanction on Chinese imports, the Chinese are probably not going to be buying U.S. treasuries at the same pace they were in the past. In fact, they'll probably be selling treasuries. That's not the only tool or weapon that China has. And believe me, China has many, many problems. And I think we should talk about the tariffs and Trump's strategy, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. But I think when it comes to people like Powell, And look, Greenspan was patient zero. I really think he made a Faustian deal with his own understanding of sound money just for the power of the position. You could do a psychological analysis of Greenspan; it'd be fascinating. But Bernanke, Yellen, Powell, look, I have some sympathy for them. If I were in those shoes, I wouldn't want the position because it forces you to be giving a narrative that you deep down know uh, isn't correct. Thomas Hernig, who was a Fed president, not the head of the Fed, but I think he was in Kansas City. He said the Fed's biggest mistake is they only think 10 minutes ahead. They're not thinking generations ahead. And his mentor said, think in the long term, not the short term. But Powell and his predecessors from Greenspan on are all short term thinkers, power thinkers, narrative givers. Milton Friedman, before he died, said the Fed really doesn't have that much power other than interest rates and balance sheets, but it has great control of the narrative. And I think, I don't want to say this I don't want to say he's being political, but it's really a lie. And I guess it's an understandable lie, but this is where I think, the conversation has to go to gold, because gold is many things, but gold is a lie detector. And the Fed officials, there's another great book I recommend. I think it's called 3 Days at Camp David. And it talked about what the central bankers were doing after Nixon welched on the gold standard and decoupled from gold in 71. And in that book, you see Kissinger and the Fed officials and the president meeting at Camp David and meeting at the White House. And the only question they had in their mind is, what's the gold price today? What's the gold price? Again, this is pre-petrodollar, pre-COMEX market manipulation, because their biggest fear, if the gold price rises after we've just decoupled, the world's going to see how they're going to see they've been swimming naked when the tide is out. In other words, our currency is a joke. We can't let the gold price go higher. And so guys like Powell will never talk about it openly, or they'll never give a real indication that there's a credit crisis or that there's a currency crisis. He'll keep talking about solutions or CPI scales or labor, all of which are bad. But, that 3 days at Camp David is really important. And again, remember, they were very worried about the gold price. That's why they had to create the petrodollar, and then they had to create the COMEX. And there's another really great book called A Century at War, Sheikh Yamani, and I'll give Luke Groman credit because he's mentioned this too, is basically, as they were so worried about the dollar being embarrassed without a chaperone, without gold, and just being debased fiat, that Kissinger went out to OPEC in the 70s, early 70s, and said, look, we have a gold-backed dollar, gold-backed oil, dollar-backed oil now. What we're going to do, guys, is we're going to inflate the oil price by 400%, because we just came out of Vietnam. We're in debt. The debt was nothing like it is today, by the way, but they absolutely intentionally inflated the oil price, manipulated the oil price to bring dollars into the U.S. I remember the Sheikh was talking to, in the book, he's talking to the Shah of Iran. Why are we inflating the oil price? And he just said, just ask Kissinger. The U.S. was trying so hard to control demand for the dollar and to keep gold prices down, because they were worried about their dollar being embarrassed. And by the way, that segues perfectly into what Trump is trying to do with the tariffs. It's just history repeating itself and rhyming, trying to create hegemony. The 1971 move by Nixon was a deliberate destabilization of the global economy to save American hegemony and to get him reelected. What we're seeing in 2025 with the tariffs is another deliberate shock. It's the tariff shock. 71 was the decoupling shock. This is an absolutely historical moment. We'll see whether he changes his tariff minds or numbers tomorrow, but the declarations made, if he holds to them, are absolutely designed intentionally. This isn't a black swan or a Lehman moment or a dot-com breakdown. This is an intentional attempt to disrupt the global financial system because we're desperate, because we're broke, because we're worried about our failing hegemony. John Connally told Nixon in 71, look, he was secretary, who cares if it screws the world? It's our currency, their problem. We just saved the world from fascism and the war. We're getting screwed. Screw them back. Basically was his thesis. And Trump, love him or hate him, he's America first. He doesn't care so much about the rest of the world. He's trying to regain hegemony again. It's the same mentality. Now, it succeeded, quote unquote, in 1971, imposing the U.S. dollar on the world and exporting our inflations, as John Perkins' books, The Confessions of Economic Hitman, make clear. The question is, will Trump, with this gamble, succeed in getting dollar hegemony and dollar respect in U.S. manufacturing? I think he's taking some pretty big gambles because, China gets can go outside of the petrodollar for oil. China is. I mean, it's important. I was trying to find the numbers. I my screen, I got my Bloomberg up here, but China can go to Russia for oil. It can go to the EU for trade, and it is a huge part of the U.S. supply chain. So it has its own retaliatory measures. Chinese are huge buyers of American goods. It's kind of like nuclear war, financial war. It's mutually assured destruction to carve out China from the equation. Um, China certainly can create a recession if there's no Chinese buyers. It sees the fiscal and monetary inflation and stagflation coming in the U.S. It has cards to play. That said, China has 60% of its groundwater is rotten from all its manufacturing and industry. It's an importer of food and energy. It has debt up to its ears. It has a real estate crisis, a banking crisis, a sovereign debt crisis. And I think what Trump is trying to do now, he's like, look, we've been suckers. There's a $300 billion trade imbalance with the BRICS. There's a threat to our dollar. We've got a bigger GDP. I think that's 26% of global GDP. China is only 17%, and they got 1.4 billion people. China has problems. If we're going to make this strike, if we're going to do this world-shattering thing, we got to do it now. We can play our cards, and so he's thinking this is our last chance. Some people think that's wonderful. Rickards thinks it's wonderful. Others think it's the end. It's to be determined. You'll see Bessent in his his press conference yesterday. Well, 75 countries are basically kissing the ring of Trump right now after these tariff announcements. Is that proof that we have the power to flex and get them to come around? I think it's a massive gamble though, because we're certainly not going to do this overnight. We don't have our what they call the goods deficit is the highest in history. If we just cut out the rest of the world and China in particular, there literally is nothing that we make right now to fill that. So that will be inflationary, and it will be painful. It will be expensive. It eventually will mean the reshoring of jobs. Apple, John Deere, et cetera, with these tariffs, is going to have to bring their manufacturing back to the U.S. I'm all in favor of that, by the way. I think we should put a tariff on CEOs of American companies who offshored our labor. But what Trump is trying to do is be hegemonic again and bring labor back. Totally get it. The problem is, between now and the midterms, or the next few years in office, it's going to be messy, bloody, expensive, inflationary. It's going to require a lot of mouse click money, and it could be more brutal than he realizes. We'll have to see. But you can see why he's doing it. But the 2025 tariffs is another intentional moment, as big a watershed as 1971. And the other big watershed is when we weaponized the world reserve currency in 2022. These are crazy things happening right now. I am indifferent to what people think of the tariffs. It's a liquidity crisis.
One, and like you said, Matt, it's like we are living through history right now. And,
Absolutely.
And before, we will definitely jump back into the tariffs and the trade war shortly. But one of the things I want to shift to is a bit of a focus on central banks. And with, if gold represents truth in a system full of distortions, it naturally puts pressure on the institutions trying to maintain those illusions. And you've worked inside the system. You've seen credit and leverage up close. From your vantage point, when did you start seeing like gold wasn't just another asset, but a threat to the entire narrative central banks rely on?
Yeah, I remember. I mean, I remember talking to some bond. I mean, again, another personal opinion, but I think it's a shared opinion on Wall Street from the prop desks of old to today, that the varsity athletes were the bond traders. Those were the varsity players. The equities guys were JV. Because if you understand spreads and you understand bond markets and you understand liquidity, you understand the direction of the markets. The markets are Pavlovian. When rates are low and liquidity is high, markets rip. When rates go up, circa 2022 as an example, or 2020, and when liquidity is tight, markets puke, they panic. So if you want to be a really good equity trader, just understand the bond market. The bond guys, the currency guys, the rates guys, I remember having these conversations again, 2012, 2013, 14, when we're in the height of QE and the Bernanke plan, which is it's the Lance Armstrong plan. It's just steroids. It's just mouse click steroids. Of course, it's going to have huge effects. It's like home run hitters that are steroided up. They're going to Barry Bonds it. They're going to knock it out of the park, but it's going to end in disgrace. And I remember in 2014, we're thinking, well, look, we know it's a charade. We know it's free money. We know it's free liquidity. We know it's going to be great for this bond bull, and hence, with this liquidity, it's going to be great for the markets. And look at the correlation between Fed and the markets. When the Fed is printing money, markets go up. When the Fed tightens or raises rates, markets go down. It's sad that that is so-called capitalism today. It's really Wall Street socialism. Free price discovery is really just a kind of a nice thought, like Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, where gold was supposed to be money. It's kind of a nice museum piece. It's not true anymore. But even then, when we knew it was a game and it was a rigged game and it was a fat pitch, if you knew how to trade it and you knew how to lever it and you knew how to arb it, it was easy money. But we were thinking, yeah, but this can't last. We probably thought we'd have another 30, 40 years. And this was, 15 years ago, 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And it's accelerating much faster because even then, in the height of the Bernanke crazy, the QE to the moon, the Operation Twist, the easy liquidity, the easy money, the debt levels have gone so much faster than the QE. And that the easy money, there's not enough liquidity to absorb the amount of debt and leverage that's in the system. And gosh knows if you get into the Eurodollar system, you get into ARBs and you get into derivatives and the amount of U.S. treasuries it takes to lever those trades, it got too greedy, too fat, too debt, too into a liquidity crisis faster than even I thought. So that, again, that inflection point was, we thought we'd have 30 or 40 years of this game. Fast forward 15 years, 13 years, we're really running out of space now. There is no other choice other than artificial liquidity, currency debasement to monetize the debt, or a Plaza Accord type Bretton Woods 2.0. But even that will not be orderly, and it doesn't solve the problem. But again, I'll go back to that IMF report. They know that they have to have credibility. There's going to be, usually you don't have a reset until there's blood in the streets in some form, literally social unrest or blood in the streets in the markets, as Rothschild said, when there's a massive mean reversion. If we don't print money to sustain these markets, 25% of, tax receipts come from capital gains. If there's a market mean reversion, that's going to be brutal for our income as a nation. All of this is tied together. But again, yeah, the inflection point is the Fed doesn't really control rates. The bond market does. We're seeing that right now. They can do yield curve controls, capital controls, but the end game is very obvious. We have a liquidity crisis. I'll say that word again. What we're doing is financial repression. That's a fancy word for inflate our way out of debt, which means we have to have inflation higher than the yield on the 10-year. And the thing is, and that's the oldest trick in the book. Everybody knows this. Russell Napier and I had a long conversation about this. You need to run negative real rates. What's disingenuous about Powell and the Fed and the markets, and you asked about my inflection point, is we know, this is not conspiracy theory, the CPI scale is as bogus as a 42nd Street Rolex. It just is. It's bogus. We all know John Williams' shadow stats is far more correct. Using the model of the 1980s, we're probably running at 13, 14% inflation, yield on the 10-year 4%, negative 9% real rates. You're losing money on everything you buy in the bond market. In official terms, you're not. But in real terms, we feel it. They're just having their cake and eating it too. They're running massive negative real rates, and they're absolutely lying about inflation. Call me a quack. But
no,
it's like
you're 100% right, Matt. About it's funny. I've been talking about it for years about how we are on the pathway of inflating our way out of this total incompetence that central banks have put us on. This track of keeping rates glued at zero before pre-COVID that helped accelerate this mountain of debt that we are entrenched in now. But as we've both seen, and I know you've been just as frustrated as me on this, but we've seen clear efforts to downplay or even ridicule gold in the mainstream circles, while central banks themselves have been quietly accumulating it. It's now not so quiet. But do you think this suppression of narrative is just as powerful as the suppression of price?
Yeah, it's just as grotesque in a lot of ways. I wrote an article maybe 3 or 4 months ago about how the few things that are killing America, obviously debt is killing America, but the narrative is killing America. And the narrative from the Fed, the narrative from the Congress, from the Senate. By the way, congressmen, senators, White House administrators, presidents have a very pathetic understanding of history, economics, and even the Constitution. But when you have 5 conglomerate companies that really control 95% of the message, in the 80s, there were 50 companies, media companies. Now there are 5. So there is a direct politicization of the media, which is an antithetical to our First Amendment and our ideals of our founding fathers, not to mention what we've done to the gold standard, antithetical to our Constitution and our founding fathers. But that's just as disingenuous and grotesque as controlling the narrative. But remember what Baron Rothschild said, give me control of the money supply, I don't care who's in office. But if you combine controlling the money supply with the power of the message. There's no greater power. That's almost greater than military power. Control the narrative, control the money. You control the infighting, the division, the distraction. While Rome burns, we'll tell you, be calm, carry on. We've got it all figured out with our thermostat, with the money supply and interest rates. It's an absolute fiction. And if you understand how it works, you'll become very disenchanted, very cynical. I don't need to say nihilistic. But as we're sitting here trying to figure this out in the West, playing checkers with our conscience, with our media, with our politicians, and with our central banks, the East is playing chess. They've been watching very carefully America dig its own hole of debt, export its inflation for years. And now we're coming to that point where that game is running out. And we're desperate. The Bitcoin strategic reserve is desperate. The tariffs are desperate. I love what Doge is trying to do. I'm all about US aid. That's a guppy solution to a whale of a debt problem. So the optics are good. The activity is fantastic. I'm certainly more happy to see Trump activity than I was to see Biden asleep and being told that he was sharp as a tack. That was just another lie. That should not be Democrat or Republican. That should be an American problem when we're being lied to, or I'd say when there's disingenuous narratives to try and keep calm. It's really keeping calm while they manipulate you and while they slowly give you the invisible tax of inflation to inflate their way out of a debt bubble that has mostly benefited Wall Street and the S&P. That's where we've seen the real inflation. The top 10%, of which I'm a member, get 90% of the wealth from the markets. And if you're really smart and you know how to go long and short and arb and protect yourself in gold, that's just more reasons for wealth inequality that the man on the street does not get, does not understand, and is causing tremendous social unrest. And we're fighting again, black versus white, gay versus straight, reparations, transgender bathrooms, schools, crime, all important topics, but they pale in comparison to the theft that's going to happen every day with your inflation and what the government has done and the greatest wealth inequality in our history. And again, if you understand history, wealth inequality always leads to pitchforks and guillotines and social unrest. And social unrest is always followed, without exception, by greater centralization from the left or the right. We've just been through it with banking bailouts, with the COVID lockdowns. I'm sorry, whatever you think of COVID, that was a historical, you're dead to me moment when it comes to trust. I remind people of Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, when the facts are bad, we lie. I'm sorry, we're not being honest with the people that we're in a debt crisis. I'll say it again, a liquidity crisis. Tariffs are just a desperate attempt to try and fix that. It's too little too late. It'll be very disruptive before it's good. And even Besant said short-term pain, long-term gain. That may be true. The long-term gain of reshoring manufacturing, making America productive again, the P and GDP, I'm all in favor of that. But please have no illusions. In the interim, it's going to be brutal, absolutely brutal.
It's like what you said, Matt. It's, between the power from 5 companies controlling the media, you have wealth inequality that's gone parabolic due to incompetent policies that's being put in place for decades. Mm-hmm. That raises a question about accountability and transparency in this system. The Fed operates in ways that go beyond its constitutional intent, functioning almost like a fourth branch of government that's members are unelected. And in that light, has gold's rise, now that the world globally is paying attention to, serve as a kind of audit on that unchecked power?
Yeah, it's the ultimate BS detector. Again, gold is, as the as Buffett classically said, and others, it's just a pet rock. It stares at you. You pay it to sit in the ground and stare back and do nothing. It does nothing. You're right. It does nothing. You can do swaps. You can do leverage with currencies, with stocks and bonds. It does nothing. It just sits in the ground and stares back at you. But it does one thing extremely well. While everything else is being very busy, it holds its value. Again, I can give 1,000 examples of how that's true. And it is a BS detector. And there is a reason the central banks of the world are stacking gold at record levels. There is a reason since 2014, even before we weaponized the US dollar, central banks were net dumping US treasuries and net buying physical gold. This is even before we weaponized. It's accelerated exponentially since we weaponized in 2022. There is a reason that these things are happening. There are all these countries net settling outside, that the BRICS are rising, that they have their own version of a World Bank and an IMF in the BRICS. Again, it's not going to replace the dollar, defeat America, and the yuan and China are going to emerge as a monopole. No, it's a new global disorder coming where there's not going to be hegemony anymore by the US. There's going to be mess. But it is the ultimate BS detector. And you mentioned the Constitution. I went to law school. I know all the lawyer jokes. but I studied the Constitution for 3 years, not just the 1L course, at a very good law school. I had very good professors. It's history, but it's also, there's a lot of things about the Constitution that are bendable and interpretable, like what is cruel and unusual punishment, what is liberty versus the right to life, the abortion debates, capital punishment, all kinds of interesting things to debate. But one thing that was very clear, undeniable, unequivocal, not debatable, was that the Constitution was written by flawed men, but were smart men, who had an inherent distrust for government. And they created the Constitution so the government would not overcome the governed, that the governing would not have autocratic powers like the Mad King George. And key to that, again, unequivocal, in the first article of the Constitution is that our money will be gold and silver. Because what did they know in 1789 when they wrote the Constitution? They knew from France, they knew from John Law in 1720, that governments are corrupt, that human nature is seduced by easy money, that if we don't chaperone our money now, in 1789, with gold or silver, they're going to debase the money, they're going to be thirsty for power, they're going to come up with all kinds of exceptions. I wrote a long article on how they did that over time. Fast forward today, we don't have gold-backed money. It's the suspense is over in 1971. It went through all kinds of permutations. But what's happening in 2025 is what our founding fathers in the 18th century warned against. Again, another lie. We have gone away from the principles of sound money, but we've literally gone away from the letter of the law of our Constitution. There was not a lot in there that was clear. That was very clear. So again, this is history repeating itself. Every nation, who among us, if we could legally print money in our living room to cover our debts, wouldn't be seduced to do so if we could do it legally? You and I can't. The central bank, the fourth branch of government for the U.S. Treasury, can. We created that creature from Jekyll Island in 1913. Thomas Jefferson warned against it. Hamilton wanted it. They do Broadway shows for Hamilton, not for Jefferson. But I'm saying it's fascinating. The more you see how interconnected all these warnings are, all these consequences of getting drunk on fiat money, postponing the hangover with more Bloody Mary, Operation Twist, QE3, calling something else, manipulating rates. But the hangover is coming. The puking already started last week a little, but I can't tell you exactly when it ends, but this is how it ends.
And like you mentioned, Matt, about being drunk, like in terms of just printing and printing and printing, and I've always I've shook my head about this, but like we've had central bankers dismiss it as a gold, as a barbarous relic, a pet rock, something held out of tradition. I recently had a conversation with Dr. Ron Paul, and he mentioned about his iconic kind of exchange with Ben Bernanke about gold. But if central banks' credibility depends on managing perceptions, what happens when gold begins breaking through a psychological ceiling they've worked so hard to suppress?
Well, again, that's what's so interesting about the COMEX market, what we've seen in these, again, headlines that should be discussed every afternoon. It's so fascinating. What does it really mean, this COMEX inflows and outflows, this revolving door, the 400 metric tons that have come into the COMEX? Why? And again, without getting into all the weeds of the COMEX and its history, the reason there's been so much, there was a liquidity crisis at the COMEX. Post Basel III, these trading desks at the COMEX between London and New York were meant to get up every morning. A small handful of players can do huge amounts of leverage short on gold and silver. That is not a conspiracy theory either. Any commodity trader, and certainly a precious metal trader, understands that. That is not me inventing that. There is absolute legalized price fixing on the COMEX. But that was created in 74 for precisely that reason, because the central banks didn't want gold to reach all-time highs. They didn't want that narrative to break through. They didn't want to see that sea change. But so the COMEX was a beautiful tool, legalized tool for putting a boot to the neck of the gold price and the silver price. But as that new precious metals are coming in from London, they're going right out the door through Globex in New York and the suburbs to get shipment back outside, because the counterparties on the COMEX that used to extend and pretend these forward contracts want actual delivery, good for delivery, open interest. That's not what the COMEX was supposed to do. What people need to understand, who don't need to get into the weeds of the COMEX, the fact that gold is going right out the door, that people want delivery, that counterparties want delivery, is because they're watching the direction of the hockey puck. Or as I say many times in the military, if you see an army coming near the river, you got to get ready. You got to load up your guns. If you see a snowstorm coming, you got to get your shovels ready. What's happening in the COMEX is the world wants its gold. They want their shovels before the avalanche of a liquidity crisis starts. These are all leading indicators. They're screaming neon flashing signs that gold is trusted more as a strategic reserve asset than the US Treasury. That's a seismic sea change. To your point, will the Fed be able to continue this narrative if gold keeps going higher and higher without the help of the COMEX to keep it down? This will be fascinating to watch. $3,000 gold. I'm not in gold for appreciation or price optionality. Egon bought it at 300. It's at 3,000. Certainly, he's made a lot of money. He bought a lot of gold at 300. So he's certainly happy with the price appreciation. But more importantly, what he's done to protect himself from the Swiss franc and the dollar and the euro is extraordinary. So even 3,000, which seems so crazy, to me is just chapter one. And I'm not looking at it as a get rich quick scheme. And it doesn't go up in a straight line. But to your point, as the COMEX loses muscle, as central banks in the East keep stacking it, and believe me, the World Gold Council does not accurately report how much gold China has. That's for sure. And if we revalue gold, even with our 8,131 tons at market value today, that's a guppy solution too, because it's not enough. That's less than $1 trillion. We did that in QE in 2020. I mean, that's just not enough to solve our liquidity crisis, our debt crisis. So all these things are happening, but the COMEX is such a critical component of how things are breaking down. That in of itself is a signal of a liquidity crisis, a lack of trust in U.S. treasuries, a desire for physical gold now at home as opposed to an instrument of leverage to keep a short on it. People have to understand the implications of that. Why are all these things happening at once? Why is gold hitting all-time highs? Why are central banks stacking it? Why are the BRICS next settling in gold? Why are countries repatriating? Why is the COMEX going dry? Because the world sees gold as a better asset to save in than U.S. treasuries or other sovereign bonds. You can still convert it to fiat to buy things. You can spend in fiat, but you save in gold. That's what the central banks of the East, who are long-sighted chess players, have been doing since 2014. The U.S. is just catching up. Gordon Brown sold all the gold in 1990 for the U.K. I joke that Indian housewives have more gold than the Bank of England. That's an embarrassing set of arrogant principles the British and the U.K. came up with in 1999 under that short-sighted Brown, because he thought it was the end of history. We don't need to worry about it anymore. Everything's great. Democracy, liberalism, capitalism succeeded. Fast forward 30 years later, the UK is struggling. They're struggling to get delivery. Their currencies, their country, their politics, their social unrest is extraordinary. These are all tied together. So gold again, this is not a gold bug case. It's a history case. It's a credit case. It's a bond case. It's a currency case. It's a liquidity case. And to your point, central bankers are running out of BS. They're running out of narratives. But the sad thing is, not because people are stupid, but because people are good. People trust those Harvard, Wharton PhDs, those Wall Street, dragon slayers. They trust their leaders because people in general would never play those kind of games in their own family, in their own business, for the most part. They expect their government to do the same. That's slowly changing. But it's not because they're stupid. It's because they're good. It's because they trust. They can't imagine that Powell would lie or that the BIS would fudge inflation. And the worst joke of all is our labor data out of the BLS. It's literally fiction. Bernanke got a Nobel Prize for economics. He should have gotten it for fiction. He should have gotten what Hemingway got for being a novelist, because there's so much creative writing going on at the BLS when it comes to inflation and employment. I mean, come on, they were off by 880,000 jobs last year. Right after the election, they conveniently. So if labor is really bad, Powell's policies didn't beat inflation and didn't help employment. What the central bank was created for, this fourth branch of government, is very simple. It's not inflation and employment. It's to absorb U.S. treasuries. It is to keep the bond market alive and keep yields low and to keep liquidity, that key thing in this new system of debt-based Keynesian Wall Street socialism. And it's only gotten worse since Greenspan. That is not fantasy, but fact. And so if more people understood how this creature works and how the inside trades work and how liquidity works and how bond markets and how interest rates influence everything, they're terrified of rising yields. They're terrified because that's the rising cost of debt. Our entire service economy, which manufactures nothing, lives on debt. If the cost of that debt gets too high, it's game over. So we got to get those yields down one way or the other. We can try tariffs and new taxes, external revenue service, all these desperate measures, Bitcoin bubble to use that to pay down debt like El Salvador did. We're following the El Salvador model. That's how desperate we are. And so when those yields get too high, there is only one solution. You got to create synthetic liquidity. You got to solve a liquidity crisis with more liquidity. Gold can only go up in those scenarios. I don't see any other way out.
I loved your analogy, Matt, on just China playing chess, and
Hmm.
that does lead us into the long term thinking from China
Hmm.
into where we are going, and we're seeing the BRICS nations, China, Russia, India, and
Hmm.
others take deliberate steps now to insulate themselves from the Western system. The
Yep.
West often dismisses the BRICS. I personally believe that is very dangerous kind of
Hmm.
arrogance.
Yep.
But
It
what
is.
signals are being missed and how BRICS nations are building financial alternatives?
Well, the most obvious signal is how much gold they're actually stacking. I mean, China's largest gold producers, they encourage their citizens to own gold in their banks. We encourage our citizens to get leverage on Ford 150s and buy big screen TVs. And and they are building the Silk Road. Instead of going to war in every part of the world, whether it's in the Middle East or other parts of the world, or certainly in Europe, they're just carefully building infrastructure plays from South America to South Africa to North Africa to Eastern Europe. Again, thinking long term, and they're stacking gold because they're thinking long. So as I said earlier, China has many problems. I'm not saying it's just a game over. China won. They still need Western markets. They still need EU markets. They still need US markets. And that's what Trump is betting on. He's hoping they'll bend and kiss the ring. I don't think they will. I think he's underestimating the BRICS. He thinks the US has been a sucker. Trust me, every conversation I have with BRICS nation members out here in Europe or in Asia, they think they're the suckers. They're tired of being the dog wagged by the tail of US interest rate policy and money expansion policy. They're tired of the IMF usurious loans and World Bank loans. Again, John Perkins' book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, make that very clear. I'm not making this up. They want a plan A, not a plan B. They want a plan A. And the signs of that are obvious. The gold stacking, the net settling outside of the dollar, the oil trade in the yuan trade, the the bridge that they're trying to do and they're going to do and are doing and scaling of net settling with a BRICS gold backed settlement currency, not a BRICS common currency. All these things have one thing in common. Gold is part of it, the dollar is not, and the US Treasury is out of it. And even the oil trade, which China is doing with Russia, in 2024, when they sat down and the BIS pulled out, who else was at the table? The UAE and Saudi Arabia. The fact that they're even willing to sit down with the BRICS and consider more oil sales outside the dollar, which will be devastating to the US dollar. No one's talking about that. Lies of omission, not talked about and not explained. You take away the petrodollar's power, the dollar falls. Look at the DXY right now. And again, it can vacillate, but the trend is down. I don't believe the milkshake theory. I love Brent Johnson, but he's missing one thing. The world doesn't trust US treasuries. There is a sucking straw for US dollars, but that straw is getting weaker and they're moving outside of it. What we see at the BIS giving gold the status, what we see with the BRICS net settling, stacking gold. Again, Wayne Gretzky said it, the best hockey players, best polo players. You don't play where the ball is or the puck is, you play where it is 3 swings ahead. And you move your horse or you move your skates in the direction where it's headed. The East has been moving away from the dollar, away from US debt, away from US Treasury, away from importing their inflation and coming up with new settlements and new structures and new trade agreements. But again, does China have an easy road ahead? Absolutely not. Is
Yeah.
Trump doomed to fail? I don't know. But I know it won't be clean. I don't think China's going to kiss the ring. I don't know if Jim Rickards is right. If a currency war and a trade war leads to a hot war, I don't know how you have a war with a country like China or Russia. I just don't see how that works.
Yeah.
I think that's absolute madness. Hemingway, again in the 40s, said that you always have a debt crisis that is then solved by, which is temporary prosperity, but it leads to the permanent ruin of inflation, debasement of the currency, and war. Now, in a pre-nuclear era, that was Clausewitz. That was war is an extension of politics by another means. But the Chinese, the art of war the art of war is the Chinese book. If your enemy is doing something stupid, let him keep doing it. There's no reason to put blood on the grass if your enemy is shooting itself in the foot. And
Yeah.
we've been shooting ourselves in the foot, the arm, the chest, and the eardrobe with our debt. And they're watching and they're maneuvering. Now, who's going to win? I'm a patriot. I'm America. I want to see better things. I want to see better policies. But it will help if we're just honest first about our
Yeah.
debt. And Besant is a lot more honest about our debt than Yellen. Trump is a lot more active than Biden. Is he going to solve this in the next 2 years, 4 years? Absolutely not. Again, I've said it. Papa Smurf can't do it. We're going to have constructive destruction, as Schumpeter said.
Well, Matt, don't even get me started on Janet Yellen. I couldn't believe what she said yesterday about how, like what you've said about the tariffs. That was a trigger, and
Mm-hmm.
but Yellen came out and said yesterday that that this tariffs and trade war is one of the biggest mistakes in American financial history, when it was actually the freezing of the reserves. I totally agree with you. That was a
It's a much
massive
massive mistake.
mistake, and
Yeah,
for
yeah,
that to come from her is just remarkable. It's crazy, but it's
it is.
with
It is.
most people still associating global payments with SWIFT, and
Mm-hmm.
you've touched on this a lot in this conversation, but
Mm-hmm.
Project Enbridge does suggest that is changing. What do
Mm-hmm.
you think Western policymakers don't yet grasp about the
Mm-hmm.
implications of this new rail system? Is it just the volume of commodities that these giants have, and the trade
Mm-hmm.
mechanisms that it will have in the future with regards to this?
I mean, it's a lot like a broken heart or a death in the family in the stages of grief. The first stage is denial, right?
Yeah.
And it goes through other stages of certainly anger, cognitive dissonance. Again, lack of understanding of history. I think for the West in general, certainly in the EU, which I'm very familiar with, having spent half my life in Europe, the other half of my life in the U.S., and again, I speak German, I speak French, I speak English. My kids are European, I'm American, but I have conversations with different cultures and different understandings of history. But what I do see, what the West shares, is in general, is an inability to believe that they're not what they used to be, that something's died, that your heart is going to be broken, that something you love might leave you. It's easy to deny that. It's hard to see it. It's hard to talk about it in the first few stages. Again, I'm not saying the end of the West or the end of the U.S. or the end of the great American dream, which I wholeheartedly believe in. I'm the product of it. I still believe it, but it's going to change. It's going to be harder. It's going to be more multipolar, multi-dysfunctional, less order, more disorder. There's no John Nash cooperation now, certainly with Trump. He is all or nothing. It's binary, winners and losers, kneelers and kings. That's fine, or that's problematic depending on your politics, but it's not going to be clean. I think it's very hard to accept. But look at history: the Dutch Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, now the US. They all ended. It wasn't the end of the Netherlands. It wasn't the end of Spain. It wasn't the end of the UK. And it won't be the end of America, but things will be different. The empire of the UK is not what it was 150 years ago. The sun no longer, it does set on the British Empire now. And Americans in America have to accept that we're not what we were in the flags of Iwo Jima or 1945 or coming to Bretton Woods in 44, largely because we ignored our founding fathers' advice to have sound money to avoid a debt crisis. And we ignored David Hume and we ignored von Mises to our own detriment. We got drunk on the temporary prosperity of a credit and debt bubble that led to a liquidity crisis and the fourth turning of our empire. It won't be the end of America. It won't be the end of the US dollar. It just won't have the same supremacy and hegemony that it did. We have to accept that. Trump's tariff policies, great for reshoring, great for bringing America back. We're going to have to go through a lot of pay, though, before now and then. And
Yeah.
China and Russia aren't going to just fall over and do whatever we say. And the BRICS are not Venezuela and Iran. It's not going to be the same. But again, Besant is all excited that everyone's coming in. Trump's approach is I want a horse. If I want a dog, I ask for a horse. I go out with crazy ideas. People come in, they panic, they decide. His gamble is that we're stronger than China and the BRICS and Russia. In some ways, we could look at this for hours. It's true. In other ways, it's not. And in the near term, it's going to create a lot of mess. I certainly hope it doesn't lead to what Hemingway warned of as war. That's just insanity.
Yeah.
But we can't seem to stay out of Yemen or Israeli's foreign policy. We can't seem to stay out of the Ukraine. We can't. We can't seem to stop fighting. And that's another sign of a desperation. It's just more signs of desperation, distraction. Certainly, it would explain our debt levels. But we have a debt to GDP right now in peace that's greater than it was during World War II, when that was certainly a major cataclysmic event in the world. And yet we run the same deficits in debt to GDP. And it's just what? To sustain this debt bubble, to create liquidity for a dying patient. It's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Well, and when you pair external settlement mechanism in how things become traded in the future, the picture
Mm-hmm.
gets quite interesting. And if
Yeah.
if BRICS nations expand and the project Enbridge becomes even more influential with
Mm-hmm.
CBDCs, and they start settling more of their energy trade in that capacity.
Yep.
The trend is clearly indisputable, like with what you've mentioned earlier in this conversation about 20% of oil sales are outside of
Mm-hmm.
the US dollar. How,
hmm
why do you think there's so much denial? And I know you just touched on that, but,
hmm
and, why is there that denial from very prominent people? And how would
hmm
this reshape the global demand for the dollar, given the
hmm
petrodollar status it's had since the
hmm
70s?
Well, again, it's my cynical answer is from living in Virginia outside of D.C. And there was a great quote by Nassim Taleb: "The opposite of success isn't failure; it's name dropping." Like, look who I hang out with. But I do know senators. I do know some FOMC people. I do know some players in D.C. Personally and professionally. And one thing they say under their breath is, look, Democrats, Republicans, why was anyone following a brain dead Biden? Why would anyone follow X, Y, or Z politician? Because they're really not public servants. They're self-servants. And you stick with a party or you stick with a person or a leader because you can get promoted or you can get a bonus or you can get more power. Wall Street revolves out of banks into agencies, and it's my cynical answer is they're going to deny because they have a vested interest in keeping a narrative going that benefits their self-interest. It's not ask what you can do for what the country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Most of these politicians and bureaucrats is what can I do for me, not for my country. We're a far cry from the plow of JFK's inaugural address or from the profiles in courage that he wrote about, where there are actually a handful of people who put national interests ahead of self-interest. I'm not going to tell you who I think those people are. I'm saying that's a problem. If
Yeah.
I'm a bureaucrat or a government lackey or a power hungry agency head, or a central banker who has to sell my understanding of sound economics to keep the power. Greenspan clearly did that, in my opinion. I've sat across from him. I'm convinced of it. I've sat across from people in Intel. I'm not saying they're all bad. I'm not saying they're all good. But the one problem is there's a vested interest in self-preservation and self-promotion that often clouds what's best for the country. That's certainly true in Wall Street, but you're forgiven. You're meant to be greedy in Wall Street. If you're coming to D.C., you're supposed to be a public servant. Very few of them are,
Well,
from the left or the right.
and in saying that, Matt, like in terms of self-preservation, we're starting to see many nations questions safety and transparency with regards
Mm-hmm.
to where their reserves are, and it raises questions closer to home. And the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. government claims to hold 8,100 tons of gold, yet we haven't
Yep.
seen a proper audit in decades.
Yep.
Now, we're seeing President Trump and Elon Musk call for a live stream of Fort
Mm-hmm.
Knox. But
Right.
why do you think there's been such a consistent resistance to transparency within
Yeah.
Fort Knox?
I mean, again, be careful what you ask for. I mean, you can spin it in either way. I mean, Trump, whether it's the JFK files, to me, I don't need the JFK files. I think we're all pretty clear on what happened to JFK, but I won't go there. It's the same thing with gold. I don't need an audit whether we have 8,131 tons or whether we have 4,000 tons or whether we have 12,000 tons. I think it certainly looks more transparent and more politically correct and more strong leadership to at least get it out there, whether it's the JFK files or an audit, in this particular case on Fort Knox. It's really not Fort Knox, it's the New York banks and the vaults there outside of Fort Knox. A true audit. There are some dark books that claim we have a heck of a lot more because we stole it from the Chinese during World War II or from the Japanese after they raided China. We've got special Rockefeller trusts that have a lot more gold that are in law firms that are undisclosed. I don't know. We won't know until there's an audit. What we do know is why was there a reservation to do so, and what's the advantage of doing it now? What I do know, and I'll say it again, whatever the number is, I'm fairly confident that China has at least 10 times more gold than the World Gold Council says it does. And I've looked into the weeds on that, and it's too long to get into, but I'm fairly confident. I'm not alone in that. I don't know for sure. I also think they have a lot more than the U.S., unless we've been really hiding a best kept secret. I would not go into combat unless I knew how much bullets I had in my backpack. I wouldn't do an audit unless I had some rough idea of what was there. And I would definitely want to know how many bullets my adversary has in theirs, especially as the world is moving away from sovereign debt and U.S. treasuries and the U.S. dollar. Not replacing it, but moving away from it. I wouldn't want to show my hand to the world until I knew what it was. China, again, playing chess, isn't showing its hand. Russia isn't showing its hand. I don't even think India is showing its hand. But they have been stacking it for a reason. Again, if you see tanks or horses or cannons or artillery coming towards your border, you need to prepare. You need to get your house in order, get your ammo. They've been preparing for years, decades, with physical gold because they saw the historical inevitability of paper money. And they're more prepared, empirically, quantifiably right now than the West. Goes back to why is the West in denial? Why is the COMEX freaking out? Why are we doing an audit if we don't know? We're playing with fire, I think. But it does look politically good, optically, to say, I'm transparent, I'm in the White House, I'm not afraid, I want to know how much gold we have. And by the way, if we could revalue gold for every 4,000 in price, we get another trillion in liquidity. We could unilaterally just declare a new gold price. But be careful, because there's a Shanghai exchange too, not just the COMEX, the New York. You can't just unilaterally. And if you do, if you make gold 12,000 or 15,000 or 20,000, China can do the same thing. They'll have more liquidity than us. So it's again, checkers versus chess. These countries have been waiting for this moment. And I'm not saying it's today or tomorrow. It could be. I don't know. But we're clearly in a liquidity crisis. We're seeing the volatility this week. Things could go smooth. I think we're heading, based on the interest rate swaps and based on what I see in the basis trade, I think we're heading towards real pain. Doesn't mean the markets don't go in one direction. Of course they don't. But every crisis, I lived through 08, I lived through the dot-com, I got out by pure luck in 01. But I mean, you saw these peaks. Even in the Great Depression, you saw massive peaks and retracements before it just tanked. And now under the new Fed, we could prevent that tanking. Absolutely. We could just print trillions like we did in 2020, and we can go to unlimited QE. But again, all roads lead to inflation. All roads lead to gold now, because we stepped away from the Constitution's requirement that we have sound money. Since we have fiat money, we're going to have fiat problems. And gold, whether it's declared a chaperone officially, or whether it just becomes part of net trade settlements or the IMF's new Bretton Woods, gold is clearly on the radar of everybody. Yeah. And he who has the most wins. And this is not a gold bug argument. Again, I'm a stock bond guy, but come on, you got to look at gold. It's not just a pawn shop thing, it just isn't.
Well, and Matt, with Ray Dalio recently described this period right now as a classic breakdown of the global monetary and geopolitical order, something that only happens once in a lifetime. Guys like you and I have been following and documenting this for many years. But do you think with this moment right now, things are going, do you think the public is going to see an acceleration of what we've been watching?
I hope so, Alex. I mean, look, still less than 1% of family offices own gold. Fascinates me. They're still consensus thinkers, and because they're run by CIOs who are former bankers who think like everyone else, and they have a hard time in that stages of grief seeing seismic changes. They don't understand history. They understand spreads, markets, and risk asset protection and diversification. Right now, less than 6.6, or just less than half of a percent of global financial assets for regular investors is in physical precious metals. Central banks are stacking it. Whales are stacking it. Hedge fund managers are stacking it. But the average guy on the street, some mavericks, kooks, gold buggers, brilliantly stacking it. And I want to say that platforms like yours and many others, and articles that we write and many others write, and we're certainly not alone. We have different opinions. Even the Bitcoin guys I know believe in gold. Ray Dalio says, give me some gold, sprinkle some Bitcoin. I'm not here to be anti-Bitcoin or not. I'm just saying all of us kind of agree that gold's got to play a central role. Central banks in the East, the BRICS, we all know it's a central role. And so, will the masses figure that out? Because it's still not going to be on a Netflix special. It's still not going to be out of Powell's lips. It's impossible for him to say that, at least without major political desperation. And it's still not on the lips of the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, or the New York Times, of which they're dead to me now anyway, for a lot of different reasons. And then so you have to get your information on the alternative media, which is full of crazy too. In our space, there's crazy. In the gold space, there's crazy. So it's very hard for the average citizen, and even worse if they're not informed. But even if they are informed, sadly, so many are barely able to get by with what they have, that even a gram or an ounce, that's a lot of money for them. And it's like, thanks a lot, Matt, for the advice, but I can barely pay rent, and I have income taxes, inflation's killing me, and I've got a kid to put through college. Yeah. Love to do more. I can't. And that's the most tragic part. Egon would agree that we could all buy a gram here and there. We could all buy a coin at some point. And we shouldn't look at that as a speculation trade like a Bitcoin or NVIDIA, but as a preservation trade. But I have to be very sensitive that part of the reason people don't do more of it is they can't. And then the ones that are informed can. I bumped into a kid on the street in Zurich who's watched my videos. He's 30 and he's been stacking gold for 5 years. He's not a college grad. He's self-taught. He's very successful. He has over 100 and something thousand in gold. He's not speculating Nvidia or Bitcoin. Maybe he wishes he did, depending on the market, but he's not trying to be a dragon slayer or a billionaire. He's trying to have sound money because the Bank of England and the European Union won't do it for him, or the ECB won't do it for him. I'm glad to see that. I don't feel guilty. If I'd plugged him Nvidia at some hedge fund or some bank, I'd feel guilty. But I don't feel guilty, and I don't feel bad. And the day I lose faith in gold, I'll be the first to say it. But history's been right for millennia. It's certainly right now. And again, I don't say that gold only goes up and to the right. That's not what I'm saying. But I can be fairly confident fiat money, which has lost 99.3% of its purchasing power when measured against a milligram of gold since 1971, is an ice cube.
Yeah.
Gold is literally indestructible. It's been money for thousands of years. It will be money again. It will be actual money, but it's certainly real money. And as famous Morgan said, the rest is debt. And again, I get back. We're in a liquidity crisis, folks. We're in a liquidity crisis. We're in a debt crisis.
Well, and Matt, we've spent this conversation unpacking the cracks of the system, but
Yeah.
leaving it on an interesting note, I wanted to get your take on one last thing, and we're seeing someone like Scott Bessent, a self-described gold bug, serving as the now U.S. Treasury Secretary. If gold is finally being taken seriously inside Washington, which it does look like it is with the people that the president is surrounded by, and even Donald Trump has said, or President Trump has said that, it would be very difficult to do, but boy, would it be great if we return to a gold standard. Do you see a path where this administration could actually use it to reuse gold as a way to regain financial footing and rebuild trust at home and abroad?
The only way to do that would be to dramatically revalue gold. It has to be revalued much higher. We'd have to first get a true audit of how many tons we do have, what we have to reprice it at to pay down some debt, and be okay with how much China and Russia and other countries have, and be okay with that. But again, I go back to the point, and Rick Rule and I were talking about this in Florida a couple of years ago at a conference. I do see gold playing a bigger role, but if you had a gold-backed dollar again, sound money, which we should have never left, but now we have, you'd have to revalue it so much higher. But it's like, don't forget the will to power. Don't forget realpolitik, the nature of human nature. If you have a gold chaperone, it's like a teenager having a party with both your parents home. That's not fun. You'd rather your parents are out of the house. I certainly did when I was 18. If I'm a politician, a central banker, or a president, and I'm looking down the barrel of a recession or election that I'm going to lose, unless I have some liquidity, I'm going to be too tempted to print more money. And if I can't, because I got a gold standard, I'm going to do what Nixon did. It's very hard to keep a gold standard. In America, up until the Civil War, we had a gold standard. Then the Civil War was expensive. We had the greenback. Then we had the gold clause cases, the Resumption Act, all kinds of things. Basically, the long and short is, when we're doing fine, gold standard's fine. When we're broke, get rid of the gold standard. When we're doing fine, gold standard's fine. When we're broke, so it will come and go. Right now, we're too broke. The only way to have sound money again is a massive, as Ed Dowd said, if Trump wants to make America great again, we need a recession. We need what Schumpeter of the Austrian school called constructive destruction. We have to pay for the karma of our debt sins. We have to take the aspirin for our hangover for all the martinis of liquid money we've created. We have to go through a recession/depression, major deflationary moments, and not be tempted to reinflate with fake money. Will that happen? Will Bessent, who understands gold, have the power to do that? Will Trump make that happen? The problem is, be careful you ask for, because if they do, they'll have to revalue it much, much higher. And we probably won't be the strongest biceps on the block at that point, because I think the rest of the world, certainly in the BRICS and certainly in China, despite all their many problems, China has many. Russia's debt, ironically, is far less than ours, but they'll have a lot more gold and hence a lot more liquidity and hence a lot more power. So it would be a new world order for sure, a disorder, and it's not a cooperative one as of now. Trump doesn't want cooperation. He wants seigniorage. He wants feudalism. He wants to have a pecking order and America at the top. I think he's misreading what's happening in the East and underestimating them, with the caveat that the East isn't perfect either. So I see more new disorder and abnormal than a new order. I see a new disorder, basically, for at least the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I really appreciate your time and your perspective, and it's been a great conversation. I'd love to do this again sometime in the future.
Anytime. Love it. Thanks for having me on. I love talking this stuff. As you can see, hard to shut me up, but I want people to take away debt crisis, liquidity crisis, market crisis. Tariffs are very important. Trump is very important, but Santa Claus can't fix this. We have a debt karma coming, and you need to be prepared.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Alex.